Viktor Sokolov stood outside a pediatric oncology ward at 11 at night, holding an envelope of cash he already knew she would not take, and understood for the first time in 41 years that there was no amount of money on earth that could fix the thing actually breaking in front of him. That was the night he stopped being a man who solved problems with wire transfers and started being a man who showed up. To understand how the most feared importer in Detroit ended up standing in a hospital hallway at midnight holding an envelope he was too proud to put away and too helpless to hand over, we have to go back 4 months to a cramped office on the 9th floor and a woman who had already decided that his money was the one thing in this world she would never let herself need. Maggie Doyle had a system. Everyone who has never had money has a system, and Maggie's was built the way a bridge is built, out of small, precise calculations that could not afford a single miscalculated bolt. Rent was due on the 1st. Her son Danny's chemo copays came in waves, unpredictable and enormous, arriving in the mail in envelopes she had learned to open standing up, because sitting down made the number feel heavier. She worked as executive secretary to a man whose business card said Sokolov Import Holdings, and whose actual business, everyone on that floor understood without ever saying out loud, was considerably less about imports than the card suggested. She had taken the job 18 months ago for one reason: it paid better than anything else she was qualified for, and Danny, 6 years old, had been diagnosed with acute lymphoblastic leukemia 4 months before that, and better pay was no longer a preference. It was oxygen. Maggie's mornings began at 5:30, not because she loved mornings, but because Danny's medication schedule required a dose before school that made him drowsy for an hour, and someone needed to sit with him through it, and there was no one else to do the sitting. Her sister Renata, who lived 2 buildings over, took Danny to his afternoon appointments when Maggie couldn't leave the office, and Renata was the only person in Detroit who knew exactly how close to the edge Maggie's life had gotten, because Maggie had built her entire identity around a very specific, very stubborn belief: nobody was going to look at her and see a woman who needed saving. "You could ask him," Renata said one evening, folding laundry in Maggie's small kitchen while Danny slept in the next room, exhausted from a treatment that had cost more than Maggie's monthly rent. "He clearly likes you. He'd probably just—" "I'm not taking money from Viktor Sokolov," Maggie said, the way she said it every time this conversation came up, flat and immovable. "I know what people say about that family. I'm not going to be the woman who owes him something. You already owe the hospital $41,000. That's a debt with paperwork," Maggie said. "That's different." It wasn't entirely rational, and some part of Maggie knew that, but she had grown up watching her own mother take help from men who later collected on it in ways that had nothing to do with money, and she had promised herself, long before Danny was born, that she would rather drown quietly than owe anyone anything she couldn't repay on her own terms. She worked. She kept a spreadsheet of every medical bill, color-coded by urgency, the specific coping mechanism of a woman who needed to feel like she was managing a crisis rather than being managed by it. At the office, she was efficient in the particular invisible way that made powerful men's lives run smoothly without them ever fully noticing the machinery behind it. She managed Viktor Sokolov's calendar, his correspondence, the careful diplomatic language required to schedule meetings between men who did not like being told to wait. She was good at her job, and she was tired in a way that had settled into her bones, and she had told herself so many times that she was fine that the sentence had started to lose its meaning entirely. Viktor Sokolov's office occupied the entire top floor of a building on Detroit's east side, glass and steel, and a view of the river that visitors were meant to notice and be quietly intimidated by. He had inherited the business from his father 14 years ago, a network of shipping routes and warehouses that moved considerably more than the manifests admitted, and he had spent every year since making sure the Detroit territory his father built never once looked vulnerable to the families circling it from Cleveland and Chicago. Viktor understood power. He did not understand people, not in any way that mattered, and he had never particularly needed to. His father had taught him, in the specific hard language of a man who believed weakness was contagious, that loyalty was purchased and gratitude was leverage, and that the correct response to any human need, professional or personal, was money, delivered promptly and without sentiment attached. It had worked, in the narrow sense that his empire had never once faltered under his leadership. It had also left him, at 41, standing at the head of an enormous glass office with no wife, no children, and a specific, unexamined loneliness he had never had language for, because he had never once been taught that money was a substitute for presence rather than a replacement of equal value. His rule, unspoken but absolute, was that no employee's personal life ever entered his office. He paid well specifically so it wouldn't have to. He had built an entire management philosophy around the belief that generous compensation erased the need for anything more complicated, like conversation or attention or the specific vulnerable work of actually knowing someone. He had noticed, over 18 months, that his secretary looked tired in a way that had a particular quality to it, the exhaustion of someone carrying something heavy and hiding the weight of it well. He had noticed the way she sometimes stepped into the hallway to take calls, in a voice pitched low with worry. He had, in his own limited vocabulary for such things, noticed that something was wrong, and had responded the only way he knew how. It happened on a Thursday afternoon that started ordinarily and did not stay that way. Maggie had stepped out of Victor's office to take a call from Danny's oncologist, and the color had drained out of her face fast enough that Victor, reviewing shipping manifests at his desk, looked up through the glass wall and knew, immediately and without needing to hear a word of it, that something had gone badly wrong. Maggie hung up the phone and stood very still in the hallway for 11 seconds, the specific stillness of a person absorbing news too large to process while standing up. Then she walked back into the office, sat down at her desk, and continued typing, because that was the only response available to her that did not involve falling apart in front of her employer. Victor came out of his office and stood in front of her desk. "What happened?" "Nothing. It's fine." "You are not fine. You have not been fine in a way you are hiding very badly for months." He said it without unkindness, in the flat, direct register of a man unaccustomed to softening anything. "Tell me what happened on that call." Maggie looked up at him, and something in the specific exhaustion of the last 4 months finally cracked, just slightly, just enough. "My son's white cell count came back low. They need to run more tests, which means another round of billing I don't have the money for, on top of the $11,000 I already owe from last month." Her voice was steady, but her hands, folded on the desk, were not. "I need this job, Mr. Sokolov, and I need you to not treat me differently because you overheard a private phone call I did not intend for you to hear." Victor was quiet for a long moment, doing the thing he did best, calculating. Then he reached into his jacket, pulled out his checkbook, and wrote a number on it that would have solved Maggie's entire medical debt 3 times over, and slid it across the desk. Maggie looked at the check. Then she looked at him. "No, it's not a loan. I'm not asking for anything. I understand that," Maggie said, and picked the check back up and handed it back to him, her hand only slightly unsteady. "I still can't take it." Victor stared at her, genuinely, completely confused, the specific confusion of a man who had never once had money refused by someone who clearly needed it. "Your son is sick. This solves that." "My son being sick isn't a math problem you can solve by writing a bigger number," Maggie said. "I need to be the one who figures this out. If I take this, I'm not your secretary anymore. I'm something else, and I don't know what, and I'm not willing to find out." She looked at him steadily. "I need you to respect that, even if you don't understand it." Everyone else on that floor would have taken the check. Every instinct Victor had built his entire empire around said that people took money when it was offered, gratefully, permanently, in ways that created exactly the kind of obligation he understood and had always relied on. Maggie Doyle sat across from him and said no, calmly, twice, and Victor Sokolov, for the first time in longer than he could remember, did not know what to do with the person in front of him. "Who are you?" he said, and it came out lower than he intended. "I'm your secretary," Maggie said, "who's had a very long day." If Maggie Doyle had simply taken the check, this would have been a short story about a rich man's guilty conscience. Instead, her refusal opened a door neither of them expected, into what happens when the only language a powerful man knows stops working, and he's forced to learn a new one. Stay with this, because the next few weeks change everything about who Victor Sokolov is willing to become. And if this story is pulling you in, this is a good moment to hit subscribe, because it only gets more complicated from here. Victor did not offer money again. Instead, 3 days later, when Maggie mentioned, briefly and without asking for anything, that Danny had a follow-up appointment across town that conflicted with her lunch break. Victor rearranged his entire afternoon schedule and told her, in the same flat tone he used for business decisions, that she would be taking a longer lunch that day, and that it wasn't a request she needed to thank him for. "You didn't have to do that," Maggie said the next morning. "I know," Victor said. "I wanted to understand what it actually takes. The scheduling. I've never once thought about what a doctor's appointment costs a person in time, only in money." He paused, visibly uncomfortable with his own honesty. "It takes more than I assumed." It became, slowly and without either of them naming it, a pattern. Victor stopped reaching for his checkbook and started reaching for something considerably harder for him to offer, his actual presence. He asked, awkwardly at first, about Danny's treatment schedule. Not to fix it, but to understand it. He learned the names of Danny's doctors. He noticed, the way people notice when they finally started paying attention, that Maggie ate lunch at her desk most days because leaving meant falling behind on work she couldn't afford to fall behind on. And he started, without comment, having food brought up for both of them, sitting across from her while they ate, saying very little, simply being present in a way that cost him nothing financially, and clearly cost him a great deal in unfamiliar effort. "You don't have to sit with me," Maggie said one afternoon, watching him eat in a silence that had become unexpectedly comfortable. "I know," Victor said. "I'm learning that showing up doesn't require a reason." He looked at her directly. "My father believed money was the only currency that mattered. I built an entire life proving him right. I am discovering, slowly, that he was wrong about the one thing that actually would have made a difference to the people around him." One evening, staying late finishing correspondence, Maggie found herself telling Victor about Danny's father, gone before Danny was old enough to remember him. Not dead, simply absent in the specific way some men manage to be absent without the finality of actually leaving. She told him about the specific exhaustion of building an entire childhood's worth of safety alone, one paycheck at a time, refusing every offer of help that came with strings she couldn't see clearly enough to trust. In return, Victor told her, quietly, in the back office after the rest of the floor had gone home, about growing up the son of a man who measured love in the size of a check, who had taught him that vulnerability was a weakness rival families would exploit the moment they smelled it, and who had died, leaving Victor an empire and no functional understanding of how to actually connect with another human being who wasn't afraid of him. "I don't know how to want something I can't buy," Victor admitted, the words visibly costing him something to say out loud. "This is new territory." "You're doing better than you think," Maggie said. "Showing up is most of it." The first time Danny met Victor, it was an accident of scheduling, Danny needing to be dropped at the office when Renata's car broke down, and Victor, watching this small, exhausted boy sit quietly in the waiting area doing a crossword puzzle to pass the time, found himself crouching down to eye level and asking, with genuine curiosity rather than performed kindness, what the hardest clue was. Danny showed him. Victor got it wrong twice, seriously, with real effort, and Danny laughed at him, and something in Victor's chest, unfamiliar and unguarded, loosened slightly. Anton Kozlov had run the Cleveland territory for nearly as long as Victor's father had run Detroit, and the rivalry between the two families predated both of their current leaders. A decades-old dispute over shipping routes along the Great Lakes corridor that had cooled into an uneasy, expensive stalemate neither side had been willing to escalate. That stalemate had started shifting in the last year. Victor's expansion into new port contracts had quietly encroached on territory Kozlov considered his by long-standing, if informal, agreement, and Kozlov, aging and increasingly convinced his own sons were circling his position with the specific patience of men waiting for their father to show weakness, needed a decisive move that would remind Detroit and his own family exactly who still commanded respect in this corridor. Kozlov did not attack Victor directly. Men like Victor built layers of security specifically designed to make direct attacks expensive and unlikely to succeed. Instead, Kozlov's approach was older and considerably crueler. Send a message through the people closest to your rival, the ones without security details, the ones whose absence from a boardroom would never be noticed by an accountant, but whose disappearance would be noticed immediately and completely by the man you actually wanted to frighten. Kozlov's people had been watching Victor's office for 3 weeks before anyone in Detroit noticed the pattern, and by the time they noticed, They already knew exactly which employee had become, without any official title reflecting it, the person Viktor Sokolov would move mountains to protect. Maggie noticed the car first, the way people notice things when their nervous system has learned, through hard experience, to track small inconsistencies. A dark sedan parked outside Danny's school 2 days running. A man inside it who did nothing but watch, not obviously, not amateurishly, but with the specific patient stillness of professional surveillance. She told Viktor immediately, and watched his entire posture change, the easy, unfamiliar warmth of the last month draining out of him and replaced by something colder and more focused, the specific transformation of a man returning to the version of himself the business required. Kozlov, Viktor said, after his own security review confirmed the sedan belonged to a shell company with known ties to Cleveland. His jaw was tight. He's targeting you specifically because you're the one thing I've shown any care about outside of business in 15 years. He's using you to remind everyone, including me, that I'm vulnerable in exactly the place I never used to be. I'm not one of your business assets, Maggie said, her voice steady despite the cold fear settling in her chest. I'm a person with a sick child. If something happens to me, Danny has no one else. Nothing is going to happen to you, Viktor said. And for the first time, Maggie heard something in his voice that wasn't calculation. It was fear, plain and unhidden. The escalation, when it came, arrived through the person Maggie trusted most outside her own small family. Renata called her at the office, her voice shaking in a way Maggie had never heard from her steady, practical sister. Maggie, a man came to my apartment today. He knew things about Danny's treatment schedule. He knew things about you that I never told anyone. He said, Renata's voice cracked. He said if you keep working for Sokolov, they'll make sure Danny's insurance authorization gets complicated. He said it like a threat, Maggie. He said it like they can actually do that. Maggie sat frozen at her desk, the specific icy stillness of a mother calculating the exact size of a threat against her child. Kozlov's people had found the one lever that would work faster and more completely than any direct threat against Maggie herself, her son's treatment, and the specific bureaucratic power a well-connected criminal organization could exert over insurance approvals and hospital administration if they chose to. She went to Viktor's office and told him everything, her composure finally, completely breaking as she said the word Danny's, and Viktor stood up from his desk so fast his chair hit the wall behind him. They will not touch his treatment, Viktor said, his voice a register Maggie had never heard from him, low and absolutely lethal. I will burn every route Kozlov has left before I let that happen. I don't want a war, Maggie said, wiping her eyes furiously, angry at her own tears. I want my son to get his chemo, and I want to go back to my life. Then let me handle this the way that actually works, Viktor said. Not with money, with something that will actually stop him. That night, Viktor's security team traced the surveillance back through 3 shell companies to a warehouse Kozlov's organization used for exactly this kind of quiet leverage operation, staffed by men who had grown lazy, assuming their employer's reputation alone would prevent retaliation. Viktor did not send men with guns. He sent his own forensic financial team, quietly, into records that connected Kozlov's Cleveland operation directly to a federal shipping fraud investigation that had been circling both families for over a year, evidence Viktor had been sitting on, unused, as a defensive measure he'd never needed until now. The confrontation happened not in a warehouse or a back alley, but in a private meeting room at a shared industry association dinner, the specific neutral territory both families used for exactly this kind of high-stakes conversation that needed witnesses without needing violence. Kozlov arrived expecting a negotiation about territory. He found Viktor Sokolov standing at the head of the table with a folder, and Maggie Doyle sitting quietly to his right, present at Viktor's specific, deliberate invitation. You sent a man to threaten a woman's sick child, Viktor said, his voice level, without theatrical fury, which somehow made it more unsettling. Over shipping routes, over your own sons, circling your chair a little too closely for your comfort. He slid the folder across the table. I have 3 years of your Cleveland operations shipping manifests that connect directly to the federal fraud investigation your organization has been quietly hoping stays contained to your competitors. I have not used this. I have had no reason to, until you decided my secretary's sick child was an acceptable pressure point. Kozlov's face, weathered and proud, did not immediately crack. "This is business, Sokolov. You expanded into routes that were never yours to take. This stopped being business the moment you threatened a child's medical care," Victor said. "Here is what happens now. You withdraw from every route dispute currently active between our territories, permanently, in writing, tonight. In exchange, this folder never reaches the federal investigators currently building a case that would end considerably more than your position in Cleveland." He paused. "Or, I hand it over tomorrow morning, and you can explain to your sons why the empire they're circling collapsed entirely, rather than simply changing hands." The room was silent. Maggie, watching from her seat, felt none of the fear from days ago, only a clear, cold satisfaction at watching a man who had threatened her son's life realize in real time that he had badly miscalculated who he was dealing with. "You've grown teeth, Sokolov," Kozlov said finally, something unreadable moving behind his eyes. "Your father never fought this way. Precision instead of noise." "My father fought with money and fear," Victor said. "I'm learning there are better tools." He glanced briefly at Maggie. "Someone's been teaching me." Kozlov signed the withdrawal agreement before midnight. The surveillance outside Danny's school ended within the day. Renata's threatening visitor was never seen again. 3 months later, the office on the 9th floor looked mostly the same, glass and river views, and the particular quiet hum of a well-run operation, but something in the air of it had changed in a way that had nothing to do with furniture. Maggie still managed Victor's calendar, still color-coded her spreadsheets, but her hands had stopped shaking over medical bills, not because Victor had paid them, but because Danny's oncologist, contacted personally by Victor with a directness Maggie hadn't asked for and hadn't been able to refuse this time, had connected them with a hospital financial assistance program that erased the specific bureaucratic nightmare that had been drowning Maggie for months. No charity check required, simply Victor using his actual time and connections rather than his checkbook. Danny, in remission now, sat in the office waiting area most Thursday afternoons, doing crossword puzzles with Victor, who had gotten considerably better at them, though Danny still beat him most weeks and never let him forget it. "The board asked me today," Victor said, sitting across from Maggie's desk on an ordinary Thursday, "why I've spent 3 months learning to solve a crossword puzzle instead of simply hiring someone to solve it for me." He watched Danny concentrating fiercely over 17 across. "I told them they were asking the wrong question. It was never about the puzzle." Maggie looked up from her work, watching Danny's small face scrunched in concentration, watching Victor watching him with an expression that had nothing calculating left in it at all. "You're getting better at this. The showing up thing, I had a very stubborn teacher," Victor said, and for the first time since Maggie had known him, saying it did not cost him anything to admit at all. If this story moved you, take a moment to hit that like button and subscribe for more emotional cinematic stories like this one. Do you think Maggie was right to keep refusing his money even after everything that happened, or should she have accepted his help sooner? Tell us in the comments, and we'll see you in the next story.